Okay, let's dive into what our source material describes as one of the most shocking military operations in modern history. The story here is, well, it's pretty mind-blowing. The covert capture of a sitting head of state. So, picture this. It's January 3rd, 2026, 2 o'clock in the morning. Inside a heavily curtained room in Florida, the U.S. president is glued to a screen, watching a live feed from thousands of miles away. And what he's watching, this isn't some Hollywood blockbuster. It's a real-time, covert military assault on the personal residence of Venezuela's president Nicolas Maduro, right in the heart of Caracas. The next day, the president was apparently quoted saying, "It was just like watching television." And that quote really captures just how surreal this whole thing was. Like watching a world leader get captured as if it were a primetime TV show. All right, so this whole thing had a name, Operation Absolute Resolve. And according to the source, it was planned down to the last detail. So let's break down exactly how this unprecedented mission supposedly went down, step by step. The way our source material tells it, this was a textbook special ops mission. First, a massive cyber attack hits, and the entire city of Caracas goes dark. Under that cover, stealth helicopters slip in completely undetected. Then, Delta Force commandos storm the residence, and just like that, in less than 5 minutes, President Maduro is captured and on his way to Guantanamo Bay. Okay, so when something this big happens, the first question on everyone's mind is, why? Let's take a look at the official justification that the U.S. gave for an operation of this magnitude. So the official line from the U.S. was, hey, this isn't an act of war, it's just law enforcement. The charges against Maduro were pretty serious. Narco-terrorism, conspiracy to import cocaine, weapons charges, basically painting him as a major international drug trafficker. But here's where the official story starts to get a little shaky, at least according to the source material. The claim is that Venezuela is a major drug source. But the fact is, most cocaine gets into the U.S. through the Pacific. And, well, Venezuela doesn't have a Pacific coast. And then there are the numbers, which raise even more questions. The indictment mentions 250 metric tons of cocaine from Venezuela, but the source points out that a country like Guatemala exported almost 6 times that amount. So you have to ask, why was Venezuela the one to get hit? So if the whole drug thing doesn't quite add up, what's really going on? Well, the source we're looking at argues the real reason can be summed up in one powerful 3-letter word: oil. And here's the kicker. Right here, Venezuela isn't just some country with oil. They are sitting on the largest proven crude oil reserves on the entire planet. That's more than Saudi Arabia, more than Iran. We're talking 303 billion barrels. You know, the relationship wasn't always this tense, but things really took a sharp turn back in 2001 when Hugo Chavez nationalized Venezuela's oil industry. That one move basically kicked out American companies, gave Venezuela control over its own biggest resource, and set off a chain reaction of sanctions and tension that lasted for decades. And maybe the biggest smoking gun for the oil motive, according to our source, came straight from the top. The day after the raid, the president allegedly called Venezuela's decision to control its own industry the greatest theft in the history of America, saying, "They took oil away from us." All right, so an operation like this doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? Let's talk about the fallout, because the rest of the world, they had a lot to say. This quickly spiraled into a global diplomatic and legal crisis. And the reaction was, well, it was immediate, and it was harsh. Countries all over Latin America came out and called it a dangerous precedent. The Secretary General of the UN flat out called it a violation of the UN Charter. And then you had major powers like China and Russia issuing their own strong condemnations. So remember that official line that this was just a law enforcement function and not an act of war? Well, when you look at the sheer scale of this thing, as laid out in the source material, that story becomes pretty hard to swallow. I mean, just get your head around this. To grab one guy, a force of more than 150 military aircraft was scrambled from 20 different bases. That is a massive amount of military power for what's supposedly just a police action. And, you know, this wasn't some clean, no casualties operation either. The source claims that before the commandos even went in, preliminary airstrikes took out radar systems around the city, killing 40 people in the process. So, legally speaking, this whole thing is on really shaky ground. You've got Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, which is basically the golden rule of international law. You can't just use your military to violate another country's territory or independence. On top of that, it also seems to have bypassed the U.S. Congress, which is supposed to be the only body that can authorize an act of war.
Okay, so this brings us to the really big picture question here. What does an event like this actually mean for the future of what people call the rules-based international order?
The argument here is that this kind of action sends a really dangerous message. It basically reinforces an old cynical idea that rules only exist for the weak, and if you're powerful enough, you can do whatever you want. And that leaves us with one final kind of chilling thought. If this is the new normal, if unilateral military force becomes the accepted way of doing things, what happens to the world order? Are we heading into a future where the only rule that matters is who has the biggest army?